My name's Oliver Sturm, in case you were wondering, but it's also on there, of course. And here's my email address. I love getting email. I think I mentioned that yesterday. I haven't received very much as a result. Sometimes my impression is if you tell people to send you email, they just don't, right? You're just like, ha ha ha, we're not going to send an email then. I don't know. I didn't receive any, so that's what I'm saying. If you have any complaints or comments on my talk or anything like that, please feel free to get back to me. I appreciate it. So pragmatic architecture, the short talk is what it says up there. And the reason it says this is because I have occasionally done workshops on this topic and elaborated a lot more on those ideas, you know, of being pragmatic as an architect, and walk through a lot of practical scenarios and so on. And so today we only have 45 minutes to get into some of that stuff, and that's why I'm calling it the short talk, because we just won't have time for quite as much detail and quite as many discussions, I suppose, and as many practical examples and scenarios as I like to discuss there. So let's see, I think on my slide deck, whoa, did you see that crazy animation here? I didn't know I had that in there, I apologize for that. So there's a little information about myself, which I always like to say is not that relevant to the talk. I just, you know, sometimes people are curious, believe it or not. They're like, why did that guy not introduce himself properly? So that's me, and since you can read, I won't repeat what's on there. So again, email address, right? Get back to me. And here's what I'd like to talk about today. The first point, and that's the most important thing really, is that bullet where it says, what does it mean to be pragmatic? It's kind of important, I think, because there's a lot of different opinions out there as to the meaning of that term, or even just the word pragmatic or pragmatism, right? What does that mean to us to hear? And so that's what I'll get into first, and then I'd like to talk about how somebody might go about architecting an application. And I have one particular scenario that I brought with me, and hopefully in the briefness of the time we will be able to go through a few of those steps and see how somebody might tackle those practically and so on. So what does it mean to be pragmatic, first of all? I'd like to just bring up this little piece of text here, which everybody can read to themselves. I'll try so too. Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Cool, eh? How do you even write a sentence like that? I guess you got to be French or something, because this Charles Sanders Peirce guy, I think, who this is attributed to, was, I believe, French. So then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. So what that means to me, I'll just tell you, it means that if we have a decision to make, we should consider a particular idea that we might have with regard to solving that problem, or, you know, making that decision in a more general sense, and we should look at what we think the results of that potential decision are going to be. So in other words, you know, I can go either left or right, and I should sit down and think, what will happen if I go left? All right, okay? And then once I've kind of made up my mind as to what the effects will be of making that particular decision, I should then stop thinking about it and just accept that this is like the wholeness, the entirety of that potential problem solution. That's what this guy here is saying, and or at least what I interpret it as, right? There are certainly a number of perhaps slightly differing possible and still correct opinions about this, I suppose. However, I also know that many people have, like, you know, perhaps a stomach feeling what pragmatism is all about. You know, people sometimes say to each other, oh, this person is a very pragmatic person, perhaps. And sometimes they mean entirely different things, right? And that's why I've got this in here, mainly, because I think in order to be able to talk about pragmatism and being pragmatic and so on here in this talk, we all have to have some sort of a common understanding of what we're talking about. We can even disagree, if you like, on the meaning of the term pragmatic, right? But we need to know what we're all talking about so that we're not on different pages in that regard. So I've heard a lot of ideas at what pragmatism or being pragmatic means. Does anybody here have any other interpretation, a way that you'd like to summarize the term pragmatic, perhaps? Anybody? Really not? I don't believe you. Come on. Okay, so let me give you one that I've heard a lot before, which is, for instance, making decisions just out of your stomach, your gut feeling, right? That is something that I think some people believe being pragmatic means. And the reason I'm posing this here is because that usually means to those people that those decisions are not very well funded. They are not well thought through. They are, you know, gut decisions, which, you know, some people assume are bad decisions, because if you don't think very much, you just kind of react quickly and so on. That's not a good thing, I guess, and you know, I suppose generally speaking, that's maybe true that way, right? Being too quick making a decision may not be a great idea, and some people associate this with pragmatism. You don't? Nobody here? Seriously? Yeah? A little bit? Okay, fair enough. So again, any other ideas what that means? Okay. Sorry, let me just repeat that for everybody. So making a decision that fits a particular scenario and is not necessarily what's being commonly done in a similar situation, presumably, right? Yeah, you know, I guess, to be honest, that might be one of the consequences of being pragmatic, right? So if I'm pragmatic about something and I kind of choose my solution on the basis of these ideas I've been outlining there, the result may very well be something that differs from what other people would do. Absolutely, right? Let's maybe talk about it like this, and you guys should have some ideas in that regard. So if you have a decision to make, let's say in your company where you work, some sort of technological thing has to be decided, you'd like to make a choice between different platforms. We're talking architecture here as well, right? So these are decisions that architects might want to make at some point. Which way to go, right? Architecturally in a certain decision. Now, if you think about it, you've all seen that kind of thing happen, right? Your boss was there, the team leader was there, or maybe they were not directly there, who knows, but we know they were involved with those decisions in some way. What do you think the thought process was? What are factors that came into that decision? Come on, shout them out. There's a lot. What's that? Money? Money, of course. Money is always good. We all want money. Cool. What else? Sorry? Deadlines? Okay, so you chose a technology because it would be quicker, perhaps, to adopt or something. Okay, fair enough, right? There was something up there? Familiarity, right. So what technology do I already know, right? Okay, anything else? Support for the technology, so using some third-party thing and getting as much help for it as possible from that side, all right? Trends. Yeah, that's important. So trends, what does that mean? Other people using the same thing, right? It's like saying that they're using it. Very good, yeah. So we've read somewhere that somebody else uses it, and that's why we also use it, right? Yeah, agreed. What else? Sorry, because it's cool, just the general coolness factor. Okay, the technology wearing shades all the time and stuff like that. I know what you mean. All right, very good. Yeah, actually, I mean, I totally agree. A lot of people choose technology all the time because it's cool, right? That's obvious, I think. Something else up there I didn't understand, unfortunately. Aware of it? Oh, sorry, client requirements. Okay, right, but okay, so you're saying the client dictates that they want to use the particular technology specifically? Okay, interesting. Sorry? SharePoint? You use a technology just because it is SharePoint? I see. I think that's what most SharePoint users do, personally, right? But there you go. Any SharePoint developers in the room? Just the one? Okay. Why do you use SharePoint, sir? Client. Nice. I like the way this is turning out. So, okay, so let's see. Who out of those who had an item here, and actually, hang on, one of the things we haven't heard yet, right, is that technologies are frequently used because the boss says so, right? And we don't always know why the boss says so, isn't that right? It might be because he's a technological genius, right? It might also be because he's the boss and he's not required to tell anybody why he wants something being done exactly the same way he wants it done. Or it might be because he was playing golf with somebody on the weekend and they said, hey, you know, how about you sell some of them licenses in your company perhaps, and or buy them and use them and whatever, and that's why maybe he walks around recommending a piece of technology, right? I think in reality there's far too many decisions being made on that particular basis, and that flies in the face of something like that up there, doesn't it? So that's kind of the starting point of where I'd like to go with this here, finding out how decisions are currently being made and checking whether or not they fit in with a description like this, or in which ways they violate that description, right? So here's the question again that I was starting to ask just a moment ago. Out of those people who had something shouting in here, or anybody else really, which factors do you think fit the description of being pragmatic decision-making factors? Value? Did we hear value before? So what kind of value exactly are you referring to? Money? Oh, the money factor. Okay, so the money factor is a pragmatic factor, is what you're saying? It might be a pragmatic factor. So your decision, you think your decision influences directly how much money you can make? You might have a gut feeling, yeah, okay, but pragmatism, I think, is not about gut feelings, right? At least that's not the way that I take it, right? You're supposed to analyze, look at that up there, consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings and so on. If you read that sentence and you think to yourself, wow, that's a complicated sentence, that's because it's a complicated process, isn't it? Thinking about all the effects that might conceivably have practical bearings. So that's like a lot of effects that you have to go through in your mind if you're going to be, you know, really serious about it. You got to think about that for a while. What are all those effects, right? Well, where do they come from? What do they mean to your own project and so on? So when you say money, I'm kind of thinking that's a really, really complex thing to have in mind initially with any independent technical decision, right? Fair enough. Maybe you'll be aware that if you have a technology choice in your architecture that requires you to pay rather large license fees, perhaps, and that kind of thing, that is just an expensive technology to run because of some inherent reason, right? Then perhaps you will be aware that this will cost you at some point. However, very likely at this stage you have not yet decided in all detail how you're going to charge for your product eventually, and what your turnover model is going to be anyway, and what sort of profit you're going to be making and so on. And so can you really judge what the importance of this particular individual item will be to you know, spend an amount X for this architectural component, where perhaps there's also a choice of a different component that has a different price tag attached to it? Yeah, I suppose you can start thinking about this. I'm just saying it's one of the rather more really complicated things to try to judge when you're coming up with an architectural thing, right? So on the other hand, assuming you did go through all those steps perhaps and tried to make that decision regarding that technology on the basis of the monetary return you will see, or how it will influence your return, then of course I would argue, yes, you're right, you are being pragmatic then. Okay, that's the idea. So which other ones? We had a bunch of ideas here. That was sorry? Familiarity, yes. So is that pragmatic or not to look at familiarity? Yes and no. Nice one. In which ways yes and no? Okay, yes, because you might have a team that can use the technology already, and no, because you might be emotionally incapable of changing. All right? So if you're incapable of changing, that is always emotional. Okay. Right, no, fair enough, you did not. Okay, yeah, I guess, you know, so familiarity, I think, is a difficult topic, right? I think your answer, yes or no, is therefore, from my point of view, entirely correct. familiarity is usually an important idea. However, it's not a technological thing, right? So the question is, to what extent will you let an aspect like familiarity take part in your decision-making process? However, are you being pragmatic for considering it in the first place? I would say, yes, you totally are, because it is certainly part of, like Charles says here, right? Part of this whole of your conception of the object, right? Choosing a technology, among other things, is relevant, needs some consideration as to the familiarity of that technology. Choosing a technology that you've never used yourself will always come with drawbacks later on of whatever kind. So I agree, that would be pragmatic. So what else? Sorry, again, specific. So, okay, so are you talking about alternatives, considering which other technologies might be a better fit, perhaps, and so on? Okay, we didn't specifically say that, right? It's kind of hard to summarize in a term, isn't it? So I guess you're talking about the technical requirements. Does a technology even do what I need it to do in my context? Oh, fair enough. You know, that is certainly being pragmatic, right? However, I certainly hope that not too many decisions are made for a technology that doesn't even fulfill your initial list of requirements. I guess in reality, sometimes there are such decisions, aren't there? It's like, oh, we chose to use this, but we just figured out a week later that it doesn't really work, and we're now using it anyway because it's somehow everybody's made up their minds about it or something. Yeah, I guess I have to agree that that happens more frequently than it should, perhaps. It's a more obvious one, I suppose, isn't it? So let's talk about the term of trend that was thrown in here at some point, right? What about something like that? You think trend, looking at trend, is not pragmatic? Okay, so you think because of the fact that trends are short-lived, people change their minds a lot about trends, that's why you shouldn't take it into account? Oh, you should take it into account. It's not pragmatic to do so. Okay. So you're thinking what the results are, what the outcome is of going that way? Yes. Well, you know what? I agree, but I do think that looking at trends is pragmatic. Okay? You know why? Because there's a trend for a particular reason, right? And there are results to having trends as well. So for example, if today I'm looking at using the same technology that a lot of other people are using, I will probably have an easier time of figuring out that technology, right? I'll be using the same thing that others are, and that means that I can discuss with those others how that thing works and so on. And especially in a very short-lived technology sector, that is quite important, isn't it? Because if we decide to go with the current piece of technology, we can't today rely on any particular level of documentation to exist or that kind of thing, right? In the past, people would have always thought, well, I'm just going to read the manual. Read the effing manual. Remember that one? RTFM, right? Where did that go, right? These days, there isn't even a manual. People just start using it anyway. And the only thing you can do occasionally when you need to know how this new and currently very famous thing works is to ask somebody else who uses it. Because, you know, there are also the people who make it, but they're not frequently the most approachable guys, you know, in some of those technology projects, and they're also very busy, so they won't be, you know, solving your own problems directly all the time. So there have to be others in order to be able to use that technology. So I would argue that looking at trends is definitely a pragmatic idea, right? I would actually argue, maybe to find a conclusion to this part of our discussion here, I would argue that the factors that go into something like this are never either pragmatic or not. I think in a way they're all pragmatic. the process that you walk through is really what's pragmatic or not. It's what you make of what you find, right? So if somebody says, well, I've looked into this topic of the technology X being recommended by my boss's golf buddy, right? Is that pragmatic or not? Do you know, I think it is. Because the question of whether or not you follow the boss's ideas determines where that project might be going within the company that you work in, right? If the boss ends up not being behind it because everybody's making a load of decisions that he feels like he's paying for, but he doesn't have any say in, he's not going to be a happy guy, right? So maybe he's not really behind the project. That's just one reason why taking even that kind of thing into account to a degree makes a lot of sense. Of course, in reality, I hope that if other factors, speak really importantly against the same decision, then the boss and his golf buddies are hopefully going to be flexible and understand that maybe you decided to not go for this technology for some other reason. But being pragmatic is really just about taking these things into account. Being pragmatic is trying to figure out what all the factors are that make up the decision and not make the decision just for one of the factors on its own. That's the thing. I have a rule whenever I go to a company and advise them on how to make future decisions, and you wouldn't believe that's like crazy these days, really. Everybody's like, yeah, what are we going to do? You know, is it Windows, or is it the Mac, or is it the web, or is it mobile, or what the hell are we supposed to be doing right now? And then they try to come up with concepts, and that's all nice and well. And whenever somebody makes a decision and they tell me, well, we have decided to go this way, we have chosen this technology, I always make them tell me at least one other alternative that they have considered in depth, and the reasons why they chose to go for this over that. Okay? Think about that. You always have an alternative, right? There is no technological decision these days where there is just one possible solution. There is always another possible solution. And it's perfectly well to go for that technology a lot of the time, or maybe all the time, or just because you know it well, or because of the boss's golf buddy kind of thing, right? That's all perfectly fine, as long as you know what you're missing, right? As long as you really understand the decision you have made. You need to be aware of what the alternatives are, and you've got to have gone through a process of, determining pros and cons of these things. And my rule, like I said, is to find at least one such alternative. Of course, that's not the end of the story, right? In reality, there are frequently lots of alternatives, and you should really be thinking about those to some degree. Maybe not all of them. That's a lot of work these days, right? In some spaces, but my rule, again, at least one of them. Is that something anybody here would say they currently do? Nobody? So, am I right to say that in most companies, decisions are frequently made to go with one particular piece of technology, even though nobody has ever taken the time to check out the alternatives? Yeah. Yes? That's sad, isn't it? All right. Is it a good idea? Am I proposing something useless here? No, I don't think so. I don't think so either. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about pragmatism, all right? It's the process, not the individual factors. I was kind of posing that question a bit in a leading way, right? So that you'd figure it out. And I think that's an interesting part, right? I guess almost all factors are relevant in some way. We can argue over this if you have a crazy idea where you think, in my company we always make decisions by throwing dice, and I don't agree with this. Fair enough. But unless it's something like that, I think almost any real-world factors that come into decision-making should come into decision-making to some extent, because nobody likes to be ignored, right? Even the most wild opinion from out of left field will have some sort of a background value to it if you think about it. It's just how you put these things together and whether you've checked where else you could go. That's what makes the difference. And that's what I consider being pragmatic in my decision-making process. Okay, let me check what the time is like. Here we go. Right, so moving on from here, I have this example here, and I've got, this is an application project that I created at some point in the past. I call it Videostream for the purpose of presentation here, and it's a practical project where a lot of decisions have already been made. However, that is a few years ago, and I'd just like to talk to you about some of the factors that came into those decision-making processes and walk through some of those steps with you to see if we can manage to come up with those alternatives and maybe find our way through some of those decisions. We have about 20 minutes to think about some stuff. Videostream is a concept of an application that streams video. Who would have thought, right? It's intuitively named for that purpose. And the idea is that people can sign up to a service and which allows them to retrieve video materials from there. No, this is not porn, okay? So just saying. it's actually technical training content that we're talking about. And so these are, you know, some of the major blocks, like I said here, of concern, particular architectural importance, functionality, and so on that I've listed here. Some major points that we might think about. The front end, a content viewer, account management, security, deployment, storage, and statistics or analysis features. However, we won't be able to walk through all of those, and I've stripped this down just a little bit to talk about platform considerations, security, and storage. And I don't know if we're going to get through those thoughts here in a nutshell very quickly. Platform considerations, however, is the first thing that I'd like to target here. So this application project is quite obviously something that will somehow run on the web. Okay, so I'm just going to jump to that conclusion quite quickly here, because that's like a requirement for the thing to enable people to access the content in question somehow online, right? And that means it's going to be some sort of a web application these days. So now I've put some of the points in there that are obvious points for consideration. The server architecture or platform or something that you go on. I'm listing Node.js and ASP.NET there as choices. Of course, we all know there are loads of other ones. I'm also listing the point of server-side rendering specifically, because I think that's one of the interesting decision points today. Are you going to go for an application architecture that uses some sort of server-side rendered pages, right? Is that something you want to do? Or would you rather stay with a basically client-server architectural model, like in some typical HTML, JavaScript-based applications, for example, today, where everything actually happens on the client as far as UI presentation is concerned and so on. So I'm listing some of those alternatives there, and now I'd like to get you involved, right? So what do you think? Are there, do you think we should do something entirely different apart from maybe what's up there already? Or would you go for one of those? And why? But keep it short, okay? All right, so ideas. Who uses ASP.NET in their day-to-day work, just as a general question here? Okay, that's like, maybe a third or half even. Anybody know Node.js? Oh dear, that's like 12. Not a lot. Are you other guys not anything to do with the web, or otherwise do you use anything else there that you might be able to call out? Yeah, please. Sorry? Okay, Nancy, right, fair enough. Chad? You use everything, right? Yeah. Go, Electro, use Ruby and Haskell. Very nice. Yeah, I wasn't doubting there's a lot of platforms, right? Very good. Services based on ASP.NET MVC, and you were saying Node.js on the front end? How do you do that? You really do? You have a front end running on Node.js? Interesting. Yeah, I guess architecturally that's a possibility. It seems kind of strange to me though. Is that a thing that I've been missing? That is a thing? Does it have a name? Okay, so you're using Node.js as an engine to run a JavaScript application on it? All right. Okay. But this is, I mean, this is actually great since it's an architectural idea that I have, I think I've heard of it now that I think about it, but it's not something that I would normally consider very much myself. So tell us why you're doing this. Okay, so if, I mean, in a slightly more traditional concept, I guess, I might have some sort of a backend system, maybe services in ASP.NET MVC, let's say, and then I might have some sort of a JavaScript application that would ordinarily be running directly inside my browser environment. And how does your solution offer alternatives, or sorry, offer benefits over this model? You have a shared component between the server side and the front end? A similar component? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm still sorry. I don't want to really interrupt you. I'm just thinking I'm still unclear on why this is an alternative of using Node.js in the front end. I mean, I could just run any JavaScript thing directly within my browser, right? So I'm asking you, what is the advantage of getting Node.js involved as a client-side component, basically, in that architectural model? Sorry, we might have picked something really complicated here. Say again? Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'm wondering about that. I'll read up on this, especially if you say it's a thing. I should know this, but yes. Yeah, but he was saying there's also ASP.NET MVC in the picture, right? So supporting legacy APIs. Sorry, I'm just repeating that. Okay, interesting, right. So you have like a two-tiered kind of server-side infrastructure in order to support a variety of different types of clients, perhaps legacy requirements and so on, with that architecture. Interesting one, yeah. Would you do this for any particular reason directly in a new application project like this? Because it sounds maybe like it's something grown out of necessity rather than an architectural idea I'd be following right from the start, doesn't it? It might be overwhelming, yeah. Maybe it's overwhelming. Okay, guys, let's focus on a few other points, if you like. Anybody else with ideas as to distinguishing factors here? What about the server-side rendering thing? Do you need server-side page rendering these days? And if you do, why? For security reasons. That's an interesting one right there. So by having server-side rendering, you know what's in your pages, right? You don't leave it to the clients. That does make a difference architecturally. I think there are certainly secure solutions both sides of the fence, right? But it is a concern, no question. Yeah, I heard somebody over there saying something. It's simpler. Rendering pages server-side is simpler. Fair enough. I don't think client application architects would agree with that, though, because right. So it depends on your skill set. There you go. Right. So you know how to render pages client side. Sorry, on the server. Maybe not so much on the client. Actually, you know about both. Okay. Okay. Agreed. So any other points in that regard? We heard security. What's another factor, please? Search engines supporting server-side rendered pages better, more easily, whatever, instead of client-side rendered ones. Yeah, I guess to an extent. You know, I'm not going to judge on each of those points whether I regard this as true or not. This is usually a matter of discussion, but you were saying that would be a point to consider. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. Something to think about, yeah. Performance. So that means to you, you would go which way because of performance? Okay, yeah, so that's for the video viewing thing now, right? So you'd like to be able to gain performance by choosing a technology there, right? Hmm. Okay. Yeah, so with video viewing, let me just summarize for everybody, whether you're going to choose something like a direct viewing technology or a Silverlight or Flash or anything like that, you might have performance impacts on that basis as well as security impacts, right? Plus, of course, I would add myself that you also have some sort of like a future planning difference between those different ideas, right? Are you really going to create a new application today that utilizes Silverlight perhaps as a video viewing component, right? Or maybe you wouldn't. Netflix does it, we know this, but how long are they going to keep doing it? Who knows, right? So maybe that's not a great idea for that reason alone. Okay, I've got one or two other slides here, so just maybe a final thing. Anybody with a totally different alternative for a server-side environment that we should consider? I mean, maybe apart from Haskell or something. I like Haskell myself, actually. It's not really a mainstream recommendation that most people would readily go for, I think. The overhead of learning it might also be quite high, I suppose. Anybody else? No? You wouldn't want to do like, you know, Python or PHP or anything like that? Rails? Say again? Go? Okay. Yeah. Right, so yeah, there are alternatives, right? And that's part of what I'm getting at here. And I think you should totally consider those, and I think you should maybe look at Haskell if you like, right? It's certainly worth it, and I think some of those also go hand in hand with your particular environments that you'll be running in, right? I'm not touching on the topic of deployment here, but if you consider the options of going for cloud deployment, for example, and you look at various different solutions in that, then you might consider going with something like Google Apps. I'm only saying this mainly because there's a restriction to the types of languages you might be running in that environment and so on. And I would also argue that if you go for something like Microsoft's Azure, for instance, there are things that work a little better in Azure than other things do, right? So this kind of thing also comes in with considerations about target platforms for an application like this. And in the same way, you could also stretch the idea of platform again by looking at the client devices, right? Where are people going to be running this video stuff that we're talking about here? Is this like a PC thing? Are they going to be looking at it in a browser on a PC? Or is it typically a tablet or a mobile device environment? Or what is it, right? Or maybe it's all of them. So you might have to consider these when you make certain choices in this regard. I think here we have a slide on the storage options. We don't have very much time, unfortunately, but that's another complicated topic, right? Storage, of course, is a very broad term, so your application or application system will have to work with stored data in a variety of different ways. There are the videos, for a start. Where do they go, right? Maybe put them in the cloud somewhere, use an existing CDN, content delivery network, in order to be able to view them around the world, potentially with an acceptable speed and so on. Secure access is required there, of course, if you're going to sell that thing to somebody. Putting everything in some other third-party service requires you to have a concept of how that stuff will be accessed from there and how you protect it over there and so on. What are the options on that, right? Which different ways could you go there? Potentially also consider doing your own thing, of course, even though I guess for performant delivery of video content that might be a rather difficult and also costly option if you're really thinking like around the world kind of access, but nevertheless important to think about. Structured data, I'm listing the basic, really big two options these days for an RDBMS, like relational database environment, versus some sort of a NoSQL environment. I think this is a really interesting thing these days. When I talk to audiences who have a background in Microsoft platform and stuff like that, I typically find that nobody has ever used any NoSQL systems, right? which is really sad because they're great for a variety of reasons, but they are not frequently considered in certain environments, I suppose. Who's used NoSQL systems in a general sense here? Okay, that's like 15 hands perhaps, if that, right? Okay, everybody else, go check out a NoSQL system. It's the weekend coming up, all right? There you go. So that is an important thing, I think. One of the biggest decisions that is not being made today, I guess, is that of data storage, structured data storage in those two options up there that we have. I think I'm almost running out of time. We have another 5 minutes to talk about some of the considerations regarding security here. I'm listing account requirements. This is relevant in the particular structure that I've been looking at here. In this video streaming thing, there was a requirement of providing access both to individuals and also to corporate users who would basically buy a set of access licenses and redistribute those internally by themselves and so on, right? So they would allow access to certain employees on the basis of some configuration and so on. And that is, of course, a complicated topic, and you always want to be sure that it's being done right, which is a consideration that we haven't really talked about so much yet. I think that's why it's kind of interesting in particular, because you may choose to implement or to realize security in a certain way because you don't feel safe about it if you do it the wrong way, right? That's kind of important. That doesn't happen quite so much, I think, in other areas, but there are far too many applications out there who have that have some sort of security system handmade by the developer of the whole thing, who thought that it can't really be that hard, right? And then there's like, you know, Ashley Madison out there and that kind of stuff. Like, oh, why do you guys have 5 million passwords in there that are now unencrypted and stuff? And they're like, yeah, because we changed the system at some point. These are just the old passwords, never mind. So, but they just hang around, right? So great, good idea, that thing. So, you know, in that regard, I think the security is a topic where you might consider going one way or another for a reason that we haven't outlined so far, which is that you would like to leave something like that for the experts, right? There are certainly other technological areas where you may not regard yourself an expert. And in all those areas, it might make sense to think about externalizing such a decision in some way, right? I'm listing here, you know, federation as a way of handling security today, especially with corporate access requirements and stuff like that. And then again, the same question is up, you know, are you going to do this yourself somehow? Or maybe you're going to use an existing system, like I'm listing here Azure's ACS and Amazon's IAM in there, which are both able to consolidate authorization and authentication in one central location, you know, and bring in external authorization information and stuff like that. So that's kind of important. And in this particular scenario, I've also had this URL system in there as well, because the access to the video content had to be restricted. So there's a system in place that basically uses signed URLs that have a time limit on them, so people can only access, even when they kind of dig around in the system and they dig out one of those access URLs that is being used for a particular video, they can't reuse this beyond a short period of time, which means that it's not as easy to just go and download the entire content, you know, with some sort of automated script and stuff like that, like people like to do. It's hard enough to do anything security related on the web today, unless you're really going to go into DRM and stuff like that, but that seemed like a useful idea, and I still think it is today. So again, of course, in that space, are you going to do this yourself? Are there existing alternatives? There are, actually. Amazon's S3 has the ability to use encoded URLs as an example, and there are probably other alternatives out there, right? So in a case like this, check them out again. And security is also something that I have in here for the particular purpose of telling you, don't try to do it yourself too much, right? It's hard. The world is full of failed applications with a self-made security infrastructure inside, right? I don't know if you guys have written one, but there's bound to be somebody in the room who has. And my suggestion, just don't, right? It's or of course get into it all the way and really learn about it, but don't regard it as a simple thing to do. That's an important aspect on security here. So I think we're pretty much out of time, aren't we? Can I get you to offer any final comment on any of those items, perhaps? Because we don't really have any more time there, but maybe something that came to anybody's mind with the stuff that I walked through on those slides here? Are you just stunned? Did you fall asleep in spite of all my efforts? Okay, guys, so if you have anything, feel free to send me an email again. Thank you very much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.